If you've ever sat alone under the humming light of an ultrasound room, waiting for a flicker you can't force, then listen close. And if you've experienced miscarriage, I see you. Type I see you in the comments so we can hold that silence together. The tech left the monitor on a slow glow, the kind of light that makes everything look softer and smaller. My hands were folded in my lap the way they taught us in prenatal class, interlaced fingers, thumbs rubbing each other to keep from flaring. I kept my eyes on the clock because it was the only thing that moved predictably. There was a steady beeping from somewhere down the hall, a janitor's cart squeaking away like a tiny, indifferent metronome. In the corner of the room, a plastic chair sagged with someone else's scattered magazines. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and coffee. She, the technician, warmed her gel and told me to relax my abdomen. Her voice was a practiced calm. I breathed the way my worst therapist had taught me to. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 6. The breath came in like permission, out like a small forgiveness. 2 years before that day, 8 months before that, 3 winter nights and 1 spring dawn, each of those times had its own texture of grief. They weren't all the same wound. Sometimes grief arrives as a stone in your shoe that you can't find until you sit down and realize you've been limping for months. Sometimes grief is a sudden cold wind that knocks a candle out. The 4 losses stacked like postcards you never mailed. Each one had a date, a memory, a small item that made the whole thing painfully real. The first was soft and private. I was 29 and believed in the future the way people believe in streetlights, that they would be there when you needed them. I remember the morning light through our apartment blinds, how the rays sliced the dust like tiny blessing confetti. I held the test, smiling fakely into the morning, and then the second line went pale and vanished, like a promise gone thin. We never told anyone. The miscarriage was quiet, a private undoing that felt like an apology from a body that couldn't keep pace with hope. The second time was different. We'd told a handful of people, because the idea of a baby had turned into plans that included names and a wicker bassinet we left in the corner as a dare. I remember a Tuesday at the ER. The fluorescent lights were too bright, the curtains too thin, and the doctor's face moving through the motions of delivering bad news. "We're sorry," he said, like that could stitch anything. The room smelled like bleach and boiled coffee. My husband held my hand the way you hold a fragile cup. The nurses made tea disappear into paper cups, their eyes quick to hide compassion so they could be ready for the next person. Afterward, we drove home in silence and counted mannequins and storefront windows to keep from falling apart. The third was at 5 a.m.
in a parking lot, while my husband slept in the passenger seat. I sat on the hood of the car and watched the sky turn from bruised purple to copper and felt my chest hollow. The world kept turning its dull chores, while mine unspooled. An Amazon box arrived in the morning with a bulky nursing pillow I'd forgotten to cancel. The pillow became the heaviest object in the house until I took it to Goodwill, and that became the day I learned how hard it is to throw away what you once planned to love. People say, move on, like it's a journey with a signpost. For me, move on was a room you keep walking around in until you find a different doorway. The 4th loss was the one that managed to rearrange me. It wasn't dramatic in the way movies make it. There was no scene with thunder and a revelation. It was the accumulation, the clinic visits, the fertility journal with penciled notes, the repeated inconclusive tests. The doctor used clinical words like recurrent loss, increased monitoring, possible clotting disorder, words that sounded like they belonged to someone solving a puzzle someone else had made. There were diagrams and more tests, and an echo of hope each time we were told they'd watch and see, and then the watching ended with emptiness again. Those 4 losses taught me things I wish I could take back. They taught me the cartography of disappointment, where it sits in the body, how it makes you borrow the future and then have to pay it back with apologies. They taught me that grief has a weight that isn't measured in weeks or months, but in the way you stop making room. I stopped putting aside money for baby things. I deleted the fertility app and told my husband with a small forced laugh, "Maybe we're just not meant for this." He kissed me and said nothing in particular, the kind of silence that was both tender and terrified. I have said I gave up in whispers and in bathroom mirrors, and it's not the pithy kind of giving up. It's not cynical. It's emptier, like putting down a cup you've kept filling with thin soup. There's a mercy in setting something down that you can no longer carry, but that mercy also feels like surrendering a map. One night, in that thin surrender, I prayed. It was not a petition for babies.
It was a raw, small thing, the kind of prayer that barely registers in your chest, because it isn't dressed up in expectation. "Lord, I don't know how to keep carrying this," I said into the dark. "If you are here, give me peace to stop clawing at what I can't hold." My voice cracked in the middle. I don't think I expected any answer. The prayer was more like dropping a stone into deep water and watching the ripples die. It was honest, and it felt like admission more than bargaining. After that night, something shifted without fireworks.
My days went on with the ordinary ache of widow-like grief, even though nothing was physically taken at that moment, but there was a new space inside me where hope had been crowded out by practical living. We sold the bassinet, my husband folded the little baby clothes and put them in a drawer, we donated a stroller, we stopped opening parenting blogs, we made plans for vacations we would take just the two of us. The world still told us to try and smiled with a certain polite optimism, but we flirted with the idea of stopping, not in defiance, but as a way to survive. We were quiet about the decision. Grief is an odd privacy. You don't want it to be the latest headline of your life. The church community noticed, though. People asked how we were, and we told them the truth. We were okay, quieter, not done yearning, but done trying on each disappointment like a costume that didn't fit. Pastor Lisa came over with a casserole and sat on our couch and put her hand over mine. Her presence was a steady thing. She said, "Don't close the door." She didn't say, "You'll have babies." She said something kinder. "Don't close the door on the possibility of God surprising you." It was less prophecy than permission, a nudge to keep a tiny space for mystery. Her words felt like a breath I wasn't obligated to take, a faint maybe in a house of no. We smiled and she left. We put the casserole in the fridge and ate reheated noodles. Life is made of those small, ordinary continuations, and they matter more than the big moments because they are the river you actually live in. Months slid. We traveled to a mountain cabin and learned how to read again, not books about parenting, but novels that let our minds rest. I painted the spare bedroom in neutral gray and used it as a place to sit when my chest felt full. I stopped wearing the necklace I used to grab when I wanted to feel braver. It was a necklace with a tiny charm shaped like a seed. One afternoon I pulled it out and rubbed it between my fingers and thought about seeds. Some seeds fall and do not sprout. Some seeds sleep for a long time, and then, if given light and water, they make a surprising, stubborn green. That seed metaphor is safe, somewhat cliché. I didn't choose it for comfort because it was profound. I held it because it reminded me that I had been speaking of the future in the conditional tense. If, maybe, perhaps. Those words felt like a hedge against disappointment. You practice hedging if you've been burned. I did something symbolic and then practical. I deleted my fertility app, yes, but I also unprimed my life for constant tracking. I replaced a calendar filled with ovulation forecasts with one that only had travel dates and grocery lists. The change did not make the ache disappear. It only made living with it possible without checking it at midnight. There is dignity even in choosing not to pursue every painful possibility. That choice does not indict anyone else who keeps trying.
It's a personal economy of hope. A few weeks after Pastor Lisa's visit, a friend named Mara came over. She was the sort of friend who shows up with soup and a sense for precise, gentle timing. At the door, she clutched an envelope, and when she sat, the edge of the paper gleamed with the sheen of something ceremonious. She reached across and held both of my hands in hers. "I saw something in prayer," she said. She was careful with her words because she knows we both have a healthy unease towards certainty. It wasn't a command or anything. It was like a picture of 4 tiny hands. But the important thing isn't the picture. It's that you stay open, okay? Her voice was small. She was not selling certainty. She was offering a soft invocation. I didn't let myself believe it. I smiled and said, "Mara, you're full of beautiful images, and I love you for that." But the image lodged like a splinter. It was not enough to make me plan nurseries again. It was enough to make me pause before I boxed away memories. It's funny how small things like that can plant a whisper where hormones and trauma have been shouting. Then the pivot came, not in a cinematic trumpet, but in the inconvenient, ridiculous normalcy of a reading lamp. I had gone to the bathroom after cleaning the kitchen. The house smelled of lemon and dishwasher soap. I did what I hadn't done in months, purely out of reflex. I opened a new box of tests, the kind you keep in the back of a drawer, just in case. My hands were steady because they'd learned how to steady through the years. I told myself I was doing it because I was curious if my period would show up. There was no elaborate wish behind it. I did not expect anything. The test was a faint smudge at first. My first reaction was disbelief, that private reflex where your own biology seems to be playing a trick on you. I waited the instructed time and then blinked.
The faint line sharpened, as if someone had taken a small pencil and traced it into being. I sat down on the bathroom floor and laughed, a small, disbelieving sound that surprised even me. My husband came in because he'd heard something, and I held up the test like a question in his face. He looked away for a moment, the way people do when they are afraid to let hope in too fast. Then he closed the distance between us, and hugged me the way you hug someone who has news that might break or might become something whole. We called the doctor the next morning. The woman on the phone sounded professional and tired in a way I recognized from our previous clinic visits. "We'll do a blood test to confirm," she said. "We'll see how your HCG levels are rising," she added. The word rising has a small, practical, hopeful sound to it. It implies movement. It doesn't promise anything, and that felt grounding. We took a set of blood work the same day, and sat in a plastic armchair that accepted everyone's brokenness equally.
A nurse with kind hands did the draw and said nothing that would change the result. We left and walked out into a bland afternoon, carrying coffee and the tiny, fragile thing of mutable hope. When the results came back, the numbers were positive and incrementally encouraging. "We'll schedule an ultrasound for a week," the office said. That was the new ritual. Check. Wait. Check again. I kept trying to live my ordinary life between appointments. Great takes at work, small dinners, a neighbor's birthday party. But between everything, I threaded the needle of imagining and not imagining. That tension became its own texture, a fabric I wrapped around my days. Before the ultrasound, I told only a few people. I did not want to gift them a brief flight of hope if it would land with a crash. My inner voice had learned to build small walls of prudence. They were not cynicism, but a form of self-protection. Still, we went to church more often, not asking out loud for miracles, but attending like people who had begun to remember the climate of a place that holds both prayer and ordinary coffee after service. Pastor Lisa hugged me and said nothing prophetic beyond the circle she made with her hands and the look that meant, "I'm with you." On the day of the scan, it was raining. The drops on the car windshield blurred the world into watercolor. My husband drove slower than he needed to, as if transporting something fragile. In the waiting room, a small child built towers from plastic shapes, and then would not let them fall. I watched the child and thought about how some people are braver about falling than others. We sat in silence, and sometimes our silence was the kind that breathes hand in hand. The technician led us into the same dim room where I had sat months before in loss. The monitor blinked like a small, honest star. As the gel went cool, my breath became an instrument of steadiness. The breathing exercises returned, now not for panic, but to maintain balance. The tech told us to look at the screen, and for a moment it was only us and the soft symphony of the machine. Then came the small, unmistakable sound. A whoosh, a thump, a tiny engine beating in the dark. The white grain of the screen rearranged itself like constellations responding to an astronomer's finger. I remember the technician's hand moving over the wand, the soft noise of her chair shifting. There was something like a chess player calculating, a pause, a tilt of the head that made me aware of the air again. "There's a heartbeat," she said, and I felt a kind of foolish joy like a child who's been given a secret code. She kept sweeping the wand. The first heartbeat steadied me. It was the sound of a small, stubborn thing that refused to be erased. I squeezed my husband's hand. It was warm and calloused, the practical kind of love that buys diapers in advance and fixes the sink. He looked at me with the face of someone trying to hold his breath and not inhale his fear. Then the technician's tone shifted. The room had the same equipment, but the space between her words lengthened. She said something about adjusting the settings, and looked at the screen with that particular concentration that tells you something unusual is happening. "Hold on a moment," she said quietly. She didn't look alarmed. She looked puzzled in that clinical way professionals look when they aren't sure if the puzzle is a problem or an oddity. My heart demanded to know what she'd seen. My mind tried to keep appropriate caution. The memory of the doctor's earlier clinical candor arrived as an echo. Increased monitoring may be necessary. The words possible multiple gestation, they had been thrown out in past examples during infertility consultations like theoretical figures on a slide. Not impossible, not likely in that particular way. But the technician's silence became an entire room in itself. A nurse entered the door, and for a second I thought we'd been called for an urgent consult. She glanced at the screen, and then at the technician, and they exchanged a look that felt small and heavy. The technician turned the screen toward us so we could see. The grainy black and white world filled with tiny, light-filled shapes. I tried to read it like someone trying to understand a foreign script. The tech moved the wand slowly, and each slide of the image felt like a page turning. "Do you want to know what we're seeing?" she asked carefully. My husband's jaw clenched as if to steady himself so he could hear whatever came next. "Yes," he said. His voice was steady but thin. "Okay," she said. Her breath was just sound. She pointed and spoke with the gentle clarity of someone trained to name things without melodrama. "There's one here," she said, and I nodded before I could stop myself. "And," she paused, moved the probe a little. "There's another. And here?" Her words slowed, like someone counting stars. The light on the screen rearranged like a small constellation, making sense only when you looked from a certain angle. I felt as if the room had tilted. The beam of light from the monitor lit the sweat on my husband's upper lip. "Hold on," she repeated, more to the monitor than to us. "I want to make sure." She pressed gently, repositioned, and the sound of the heartbeats multiplied like notes overlapping in a chord I hadn't expected. I felt my hands go cold and then hot. I remembered breathing and tried to keep to the rhythm as if my breath could hold the moment together without shattering. The door to the hallway stood ajar, and the rain made a soft pattern on the concrete outside. For a beat, the entire world seemed to contract to the curve of my husband's hand and the pale glow of the screen. My husband leaned forward and mouthed, "How many?" The technician's face was a portrait of professional care and the beginning of surprise. She didn't answer him right away.
Her fingers moved like a translator between what the machine showed and what our eyes were allowed to believe. "There are multiple," she said finally, and her voice had a tremor that was not clinical anymore, but human. The room held its breath with us. For a moment, all the training in measured words failed, and we hovered between grief and possibility, between the small life we had been used to and the sudden, dizzying expansion of an imagined future. My throat tightened. My husband's cheek brushed mine like a question mark. We were not prepared for the scale of a word like multiple. It felt like an invitation with no space to accept or decline. At the door, the nurse consulted the schedule on a tablet, then offered a practical, steadying statement. "We'll need to get you into maternal fetal medicine for closer monitoring. There are increased risks with multiple gestations, preterm labor, NICU possibility, closer surveillance. You won't be alone in this, but we'll need to plan more visits and possibly specialized care." Her words were practical and tempered. They did not dampen the surrealness of what we were seeing. Instead, they drew a map, an outline of the storm we might be entering. The medical language wired itself into my mind like a brace, giving the situation its shape, possibility woven with risk, joy threaded with vigilance. That framing was not meant to take away joy. It was meant to inform it, to keep us from fantasizing without planning. My mind raced through medical images like flashcards, incubators, hospital gowns, specialists with kind but serious eyes. I thought of finances, the practical math of expanding one life into 4, and of our fragile emotional reserve. I thought of the losses, and the way my heart had learned to armor itself. The technician moved the wand again, and the screen showed what looked like 4 small, bright seeds in a dark soil. My first honest reaction was incomprehension, then a rush of something primal and large, laughter that had a tear stitched through it. My husband made a sound I cannot name, part laugh, part intake of shock. He squeezed my hand so hard that for a second I felt the press of his nail on my palm like a punctuation. He leaned in and whispered, "Quadruplets?" like a question to God and the world all at once. His mouth trembled as the word came out. The technician's expression softened into a private smile that acknowledged the moment's strangeness. She said, "We can see 4 gestational sacs. I want to confirm with a follow-up and a maternal fetal specialist, but it appears to be 4. Her tone was both careful and, I think, a little delighted in the human way professionals sometimes are. They witness wonder without claiming it. I felt dizzy, as if someone had opened a window in a stifling room, and a wind had come in with scents and noise, and the possibility of more.
My brain tried to reconcile the 4 shadows on the screen with 4 of anything in our lives. 4 tiny socks, 4 names, 4 tiny choruses of midnight crying. The mind makes lists to make sense, and I started making lists inwardly. names, rooms, the math of feeding schedules that would become our new geometry. Then the technician looked at us with professional kindness and reminded us of the practical steps. We'll set up an appointment with maternal fetal medicine. There are increased risks with multiple pregnancies, including preterm birth and the possibility of NICU care. You'll likely have more frequent scans and monitoring. We'll connect you with social work if you need financial assistance or community resources. Her words were a protective belt. I welcomed them and hated their sober logic at the same time. They were necessary and earthbound, not meant to eclipse the shape of what we were seeing. We left the clinic in the rain, umbrella up and little drops forming at the hem of our jackets like punctuation. My husband drove with the same slow care, and at a red light he tapped the steering wheel and said, "We need to call Mara." Later I thought about how we needed to call so many people and how we didn't want to. There was a line between jubilation and something closer to fear that required privacy to digest. In the car I let myself pray again, but this time the prayer was different from the previous surrender. "Lord," I breathed, eyes on the raindrop stage of the windshield. "I don't know how this will be or what this will cost us. If you are here, help us to walk this without losing our minds or each other. Give us wisdom and steady hands." It was a small, honest petition, not asking for a particular result, but for help to steward whatever comes. That second prayer felt like a rope thrown across our chasm, something practical enough to grab, but humble enough to accept whatever pulled on it. We did not explode in joy. We did not immediately start shopping for 4 bassinets. We were too young in this news to go there. Instead, we called the people who had held us through the losses, Pastor Lisa, Mara, and a few of the friends who knew the story in all its bruised history. Fingers tapped responses that read like a litany of love, crying emoji, prayer hands, immediate offers to help. The community response was not theatrical. It was casserole lists and offers for babysitting in the future that felt like anchors. The church organized a small group to pray with us the next night. They did not promise outcomes. They promised presence. That night, a handful of friends gathered around our kitchen table. Someone had brought coffee. Someone else had made lemon bars. Pastor Lisa led us in a short prayer that acknowledged both the impossibility and the practical needs. She prayed for wisdom for the doctors, for strength for our bodies, for community to step in.
The sounds of cups and spoons were like the music of practical faith, people showing up with both prayer and casserole. Hands were held, we breathed as a group, the breathing motif weaving us together. I felt my fear and my gratitude folded into the same hand that my pastor clasped. Still, between the prayer and the pivot to action, there was an interior counterpoint that demanded integrity. I kept thinking of the 4 losses, and of how grief had taught me to make plans that guarded my heart. The nurse's words bounced back. Preterm birth, NICU possibility. Medical reality does not stand in opposition to faith, but it does insist on caution. We made the appointment with maternal fetal medicine. We sat with a planner and a tally sheet and tried to imagine logistics without letting our imagination run wild. When we texted the news to my sister, she sent a string of messages that ended with, "I don't even know what to say except thank you for letting us in." It felt right to let people in slowly, to allow their wonder to be real, while holding the edges of our own trembling. We started making practical lists. Who would come to appointments? Who could bring meals? Who could help with older family members if needed? We also called our workplace, careful to let HR know that we might need flexibility. We applied for no benefits. We simply started arranging a lattice of practical supports. The miracle did not cancel the work of living. It required us to learn how to ask. And so we waited again. But this waiting was different. It felt like standing on a shoreline, not because a tide had always left you dry, but because now waves might come in too fast, and you'd need to be ready. We had hope, yes, but we had learned the hard humility of pairing hope with preparedness. The maternal fetal appointment was scheduled for the following week. Between the clinic and that appointment, my sleep became a series of half-restful hours where my brain rehearsed both joyous scenes and the one where the doctor's face goes calm and tells us to prepare. I learned to breathe in the middle of those rehearsals, to anchor myself with the simple motion of air moving through me. Breathe in, breathe out. Hold the moment the way you hold a fragile letter. On the evening before the appointment, I lay awake and pictured 4 tiny hands. Not in a prophetic or certain way, just a picture Mara had given me and a fragile hope I refused to weaponize. I thought of the losses and how this possibility felt like a doorway opening that I had not asked to enter. There was terror and outlawed joy tangled like yarn. I stroked the necklace seed between my fingers. Seeds can rest for seasons. Seeds can sprout when conditions are odd.
I did not know what would unfold. I only knew I could not take back the tenderness that had begun to unfurl in my chest.
The morning of the maternal-fetal appointment arrived, and with it a new set of small rituals. The recommended water intake, the call to check in, the prompt to bring someone with me. My husband came, of course. He had been steady, in a way that was practical and simple. We signed forms with clean pens, sat in a waiting room with plants that smelled faintly of soil and hope, and watched a small child in a corner clutching a stuffed elephant like an amulet. When the doctor entered, she was not the man from the ER with a practiced apologetic face. She was a specialist with an air of competency and steady eyes. She introduced herself and said, "We'll do some targeted scans and discuss a plan." She used the medical terms that felt like architecture for the unknown: chorionicity, placentation, monitoring schedule, risks like preterm labor and need for NICU care. She spoke plainly about the possibility that multiples are more likely to be born early and that we would need to prepare for extra care. She did not say anything to dampen hope, but she also did not romanticize the road ahead. "You'll be seen more often," she said. "We'll check growth, we'll look at the placentas and how they're arranged. Those things will inform our recommendations." Her voice had the quality of someone who gives you a map and knows some paths are steeper than others. "We will coordinate with neonatology if necessary," she added, "and social work can help with resources. You won't be doing this alone." Practical sentences knit with compassionate recognition. I liked that balance. When she said the word possible NICU stay, it landed like the nurse's earlier words: careful, not cruel. Those clinical realities are not meant to frighten, they are meant to prepare. I felt oddly grateful for the clarity. It let me put some scaffolding around the possible chaos. We scheduled the follow-up ultrasound for 2 weeks out. The doctor gave us a list of support resources: counseling, community volunteers who could offer meals, and a financial planner the hospital partners with for families expecting multiples. I appreciated the thoroughness. Hope without planning can be precarious. Planning without hope is hollow. We needed both. On our way out, Pastor Lisa stopped by the clinic lobby with a bag of muffins. She hugged us both and said a quiet, confident, non-prescriptive word: "We'll be walking with you." The phrase was the kind of commitment that doesn't erase difficulty, but promises presence in it. In the days that followed, I walked and talked and breathed more deliberately. I made calls and accepted offers. I began to imagine what living would feel like with a house full of infants, and that imagination had both bright and dark corners. I let myself dream in small increments: a single pink onesie I dared to buy, and then returned when my practicality asked why I should risk sorrow.
Then I bought a small neutral blanket instead, something that felt like a step, but not a possession. And then, the night before the follow-up ultrasound, a fear woke me. What if one didn't make it, or two? The mind is a cruel cartographer. It draws routes through every possible storm. I prayed again, quietly and hard, not asking for outcomes, but for courage and presence. "Lord," I said, chest tight in the dark, "give us steady hands and steady hearts. If you move, move us with you. If not, stay with us in the sorrow. Help us to trust we won't be swallowed by the fear." It felt different this time, a prayer that sat like a hinge between hope and realism. It felt like preparing a home for a guest you both fear and want. The night before the follow-up, I slept in fits and starts. The seed necklace rested against my chest like a secret I could cradle but not speak aloud. At dawn, I woke with the kind of clarity that feels like being shoved into action. Pack a bag, make a list, bring the phone charger. My husband made coffee in that concentrated quiet he takes on when he's preparing for something that feels bigger than him. We drove to the maternal fetal medicine unit with the rain still wet on the windshield and a playlist of instrumental songs that kept the silence dignified. The clinic smelled different from the general OB office, a cleaner, cooler scent, the kind of air you imagine winds through places where complicated things are watched very closely. We checked in, and a nurse gave us a folder with pamphlets: growth curves for multiples, sample NICU photos, clinical and personal, and a list of questions to ask. The pamphlet had a line in small type: "Support is available. Ask us." That small sentence felt like a handrail. The specialist who greeted us introduced herself slowly, with the patience of someone who has navigated good news and disaster enough times to know how to keep both in the same room. She had the kind of voice that made you believe complexity could be translated into action,
We'll start with targeted ultrasound today to determine chorionicity, she said, naming the first of many terms that would become part of our vocabulary. For now, the main things I want you to take away: we'll need more frequent monitoring, there's an increased risk for preterm delivery, and we'll work closely with neonatology to plan for any outcomes. We'll also connect you with social work to talk about resources. Do you have any questions before we start? I asked the small, helpless question everyone asks. Is this possible? It felt clumsy and vast at once. The doctor tilted her head slightly, the way a person does when they are about to be honest but not alarmist. It's possible? Yes, she said. And possible comes with a landscape. We will measure growth, check for shared placentas or separate lungs, and make decisions as the pregnancy progresses. Multiples can be beautiful and they can be complicated. Our job is to anticipate and prepare.
She said, prepare, like a promise to do the making of plans, not a guarantee of outcome. That distinction steadied me more than anything else in the room. It's one thing to be given hope. It's another to be given a map. The scans were thorough, methodical, measure here, angle there, a whisper of conversation between technicians as they documented what they saw. We saw clear gestational sacs, and as the specialist explained placentation, she used her finger to outline shapes in the air so I could follow. These are all separate sacs, she said at one point. That's an important detail because it affects how the pregnancy will be monitored. The language was exact and not sentimental. It held care without swaddling the truth in euphemism. You will likely be seen every 2 to 3 weeks, she continued. We'll watch growth and cervix length. We'll chart the baby's sizes and how they're developing. Short cervix or early contractions would be concerns to bring us in earlier. Neonatology will meet with you to explain NICU possibilities and what they do to support preterm infants. Even as she spoke, the word NICU landed like a rock in the center of my chest. I'd imagined it in the sterile way the pamphlet did, cradles and machines and clinical competence, but it still felt like a room that might swallow our joy. The doctor saw my face and softened her tone. We take this one step at a time, she said, and we will take steps together. We left that appointment with a stack of follow-up dates and an email address for social work. Someone had noted down names of support groups for families expecting multiples, and a recommended lactation consultant who had experience with preterm infants. The level of detail was a relief. It didn't eliminate fear, but it gave us tasks, and tasks are a kind of armor for people who have learned to live by lists. Between appointments, time had a strange elasticity. I found intervals of normalcy, work days where I was competent and effective, a friend's wedding where we wore our best faces, but threaded through all of it was the low-grade hum of monitoring. People texted with questions and offers. Some days I felt buoyed by community. Other days I felt like a balloon with a paperweight tied to the string. We prepared in practical ways that felt simultaneously humble and extravagant. We started interviewing a doula who had experience with high-risk pregnancies and a neonatal nurse who could help us think through options for breastfeeding if the babies arrived early. We cleared space in our home, moved furniture so there would be an area that could serve as a feeding station, and made peace with the idea that we'd perhaps never sleep through a night again. Financial conversations, once whispered, became a phone call with our bank and a discussion with our employers about extended leave. We were learning to ask for the help we would almost certainly need. And then the small crises arrived in their own time. At 28 weeks, I woke in the middle of the night with what felt like a tightening that wouldn't let go. I called the hospital from the bathroom and then woke my husband. The triage nurse told me to come in right away. At the hospital, I was monitored for contractions. They were regular enough to make the nurse frown and call the doctor. I sat on the edge of a bed with warm strips across my belly and a monitor beeping like a metronome that had learned improvisation. The doctor on call moved with calm urgency. "We're seeing contractions," she said, matter of fact. "I want you in for observation. With multiples, the threshold for intervention is lower because of the risk of preterm labor. We'll give you steroids for lung maturity if needed, and we'll discuss tocolytics to try to slow labor if it's happening too fast." The words steroids and tocolytics sounded like chemical armor, medicine stepping in where unbidden biology had taken the reins. The interventions did their work. The contractions tapered after a night of IV fluids and magnesium, and I was discharged with orders to rest and call if anything changed. We came home with a new respect for the hospital and its rhythms, for the way medicine can both constrain and support hope. The close calls continued, and were always accompanied by that double sensation, the enormous joy of life being present and the sobering awareness that the road could be narrow. There were trips to the clinic for growth scans that revealed one baby lagging slightly behind the others. The specialist adjusted our monitoring schedule and reminded us that growth discrepancies often require earlier delivery if they become worrying.
Several nights I lay awake calculating weights, imagining tiny futures and their medical appendages, breast pumps, tubes, tiny ventilators, and wondering how one family could keep all that fratfoggertancy afloat. Community, again, made the difference. Meals arrived like punctuation. Friends came to sit with us through late-night feeds of worry. The church organized rotating rides to appointments for my husband so he could be with me without dealing with work stressors like driving home late at night alone. A neighbor, whom we barely knew, offered to set up a crowdfunding page for hospital-associated costs, and the outpouring of help made the financial side less terrifying. We learned to accept without guilt. It was a lesson my grief had previously taught. Needing help is not a sign of failure, but a call to let others serve. As the pregnancy progressed, the specialists discussed timing of delivery with more frequency. The statistical likelihood for multiples, especially quadruplets, pointed toward preterm delivery, often somewhere between 28 and 34 weeks for high-order multiples. Conversations revolved around balancing fetal maturity with risks that increase the longer the pregnancy continues.
We met with neonatology multiple times. They brought us into a room with tiny models of preemie incubators and explained the spectrum of NICU care in plain terms: respiratory support, gavage feeding, monitoring for jaundice and temperature control. They showed us families who had walked through long NICU stays and eventually taken their children home. Their tone was balanced, hopeful realism. We took childbirth classes tailored for multiples. They showed us how cords might be positioned differently, how cesarean delivery is more likely in higher-order multiples, and what to expect in a C-section if we reach that point. I learned to let the medical contingencies be part of my inner map, without making them the only destination. It was a practice in holding two truths at once. We were carrying a rare, astonishing life, and we were walking a high-wire path. The breathing practice became a ritual, less a therapy than a daily liturgy. I would stop whatever I was doing, place my hand on my belly, and breathe slowly. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 6. The motion taught me to be present in each contraction and each cup of tea, in the silent grocery aisles and the late-night fear. When panic rose, like the time a small bleed appeared and sent us rushing to the hospital, I would anchor myself with breath until the situation resolved into a plan. At 31 weeks, signs began to suggest we should plan for delivery soon. The specialist called a meeting with the entire team: maternal fetal medicine, neonatology, anesthesiology, and social work. We sat in a conference room that smelled faintly of coffee and printed protocols. There were diagrams on a screen and a stack of patient handouts on the table. Each specialist introduced themselves in clipped, compassionate sentences, and then turned to what they would do and what we should expect. Given the number and the locations of the placentas, some of the babies are at risk for growth discordance and preterm delivery, the physician said. At this point, we think delivery around 32 to 33 weeks may be the safest course to balance growth and risk. She explained the reasoning carefully. You will likely need a scheduled cesarean delivery, and neonatology will be ready at the bedside. There is a possibility of NICU stays ranging from days to weeks, sometimes longer. We'll place an IV before surgery and discuss anesthesia options and blood bank availability with you. My husband squeezed my hand until I felt the ridges of his knuckles under my palm. The words scheduled cesarean felt both terrifying and blessedly concrete. If there's a map, you can at least pack. We had hoped for a full-term birth, as any parent might, but realism had its own gravity and its own mercy. The plan was set. Surgery the following week, with neonatology present and dedicated staff to manage the immediate postpartum period.
The day of the C-section arrived with a dawn that felt steady, as if the sky had agreed to not surprise us. We checked in early, trading our street clothes for gowns that made us feel strangely ceremonial. The operating room smelled of antiseptic and polished metal. People moved with the quiet competence of rehearsed choreography. The bright lights overhead, and my husband's face leaned over mine, an island of familiarity in a sea of clinical precision. "Hi, I'm Dr. Patel," said the surgeon, introducing the lead neonatologist beside her. "We're going to be with you the whole time." The surgeon's hands were steady as she talked through the anesthesia and the incision. There was a prayer in my chest that wasn't a second-person address. It was a tight internal exhale that asked for safe passage for all of us. There was no guarantee, only a collective hope held in the hands of many professionals. When the first tiny cry came, it was like a bell. I had imagined cries before, sometimes in technicolor, sometimes in terror. But the reality is simpler and more urgent. The air in the room seemed to sharpen. One by one, babies were delivered and given to neonatology staff for immediate evaluation. I remember the chorus of small, urgent noises, suctioning, muffled coos, the soft murmur of pediatric voices. A nurse pressed a warm hand to my cheek and said, "They look good for their age. We're working on breathing support if needed." The neonatologist brought each child to us briefly, skin pink and slippery, a tangle of tiny limbs, and then moved them to the incubators where they would be stabilized. We didn't get to hold all 4 in the operating room.
It's the way multiples birth often works when NICU involvement is necessary. But the glimpse was enough. A warm fist clutching at the air, a smudged tuft of hair, a little cry like a small alarm. It was pure, concentrated life. The first hours after surgery were a blur of exhaustion and adrenaline. In recovery, I was surrounded by soft humming machines and visitors with tired, bright faces. My husband, our parents, one nurse who had brought a small stuffed rabbit and placed it gently in the bassinet beside the incubators. The neonatal team updated us with a cadence that alternated between clinical language and tender reassurance. 2 of the babies required brief respiratory support but are stable, they said. We're providing CPAP for baby A and baby B is self-ventilating. All our feeding attempts supported with gastric tube as needed. We'll keep monitoring for temperature regulation and jaundice. Those phrases, unfamiliar and heavy, were also a pattern I could follow, step by step, problem by problem.
I found that the human response to medical complexity is to compartmentalize. You take each issue as it comes because the alternative is being swallowed by a tidal wave of what-ifs. We were allowed into the NICU that evening with careful instructions, hand hygiene, a limit on visitors, the policy of quiet. My first step into that room was like entering a sacred, complicated chapel. Incubators lined up with warm, filtered light and a chorus of steady beeps that eventually grew familiar. Nurses moved with gentle confidence, changing diapers that fit in the palm of a hand, adjusting tiny hats to maintain warmth. Machines hummed like patient engines, an oxygen monitor flared green when a breath was deep and blue otherwise. My husband and I stood side by side, our hands laced over the plastic of the incubators as if the barrier wasn't real. We named them not yet out of sentimentality, but out of the human habit of making people whole with a word. Number 1. My husband whispered to the smallest, who had a stubborn set of lungs. Number 2, I said to the one who kept latching weakly. The nurse smiled at our murmured nicknames and told us the baby's given identifiers were temporary, that naming would come later when things settled. The NICU staff taught us how to do kangaroo care, skin-to-skin contact that is scientifically proven to regulate temperature and breathing in preemies. The moment my cheek rested against the tiny back of one of our babies, something inside of me unknotted. The medical world could be loud and technical and alarming, but the simple heat of a small body on mine felt like an answer to a long, complicated prayer. There was no tidy theology to write about that moment, only the physical truth that human warmth matters, that holding is medicine. Days in the NICU became a new kind of rhythm. We spent hours there, one parent or the other holding a baby against their chest, eyes closed against the fluorescent lights, breathing together in a shared cadence. Nurses taught me how to tube feed with a syringe, how to read the tiny flutters that signaled satiety, how to record weight gain in increments that felt both slow and monumental. Between feedings, we slept in folding chairs, trading off naps so someone could be with each baby. There were moments of triumph, a day one baby removed from oxygen to breathe on their own, a weight gain that nudged us past a worrying threshold. There were also tests, moments of bated breath, rounds led by neonatologists poring over curves and graphs. Grief, which had looked different at each loss, reappeared in the NICU in a new form. The grief for the ease we would never have, and the grief for the predictable life that had been, in many ways, already fragmented.
But compassion came in streams. Volunteers brought meals. Our church organized a rota of caregivers to sit with us while we slept at odd hours. A small group from the youth ministry showed up one evening with a whiteboard full of names and offers, diaper runs, grocery lists, laundry help. I learned to accept that we would not bounce back into normal quickly. Postpartum with quadruplets is not a recovery, but a long, often non-linear reweaving. My body was healing from surgery while I tried to pump enough milk to supplement the baby's needs. My husband ran shifts, one at the NICU, one at home, keeping our lives connected to the practical world. Sleep, when it happened, was both an indulgence and a necessity. My mother came and sat with me in the hospital cafeteria once and said quietly, "Don't rush yourself to be okay." Nobody had to convince me of the truth of that sentence. The trauma of the past losses had not been erased. It had been complicated by this new reality. After 3 weeks, the neonatologists began talking about discharge plans. The babies still needed tube feeds at times, and 2 required extra oxygen during sleep, but their weight and respiratory status had improved steadily. "We'll do a trial of rooming in," the nurse told us. "We want to see how you manage on your own before taking 4 home." The idea of bringing them home was dizzying, equal parts joy and fear. The day we rolled the last incubator through hospital doors into our car felt like stepping out of one season into another. The car smelled of warm upholstery and the faint antiseptic tang that clung to everything in the NICU.
One of the nurses walked us to the van with a list of instructions clipped in her hand. She showed us safe car seat practices for preemies, how to maintain feeding logs, schedules for follow-up appointments. She gave us a list of emergency contacts, numbers that once we left would become our lifeline. Our house had been arranged in the months before, a cluster of bassinets in a room lined with soft gray blankets, diapers stacked like a small fort, a rotating chart with feeding times and medication. It looked like preparation, and yet nothing could fully prepare us for the volume of new life. That first night home was tender and loud and full of wonder and exhaustion. We fed on a schedule that felt both precise and holy, a rhythm of 45 minutes, then sleep, then the lift and small panic of waking again. We worked the schedule like sailors learn seamanship, timing feeds, changing diapers, measuring weights, recording notes for the pediatrician. The practicalities of daily life became a study in small economies, how to stretch nap times, how to tether our sanity to caffeinated coffee and a neighbor who would cook dinner once a week without drama. We learned to ask for help. One friend came every Thursday for 6 months to vacuum and fold laundry. Another took our eldest niece for Saturday mornings to keep some normalcy in the family.
We accepted help as a means of staying afloat, not a sign of failure. Emotionally, everything felt raw and gilded at the same time. Night feeds were both the most intimate and the most grueling. I would sit in a low chair with one baby at a time, feeling the weight of new parenthood settle into my limbs. Sometimes I would glance across the room and watch my husband sleeping in brief, contested bursts, his face soft with relief. We spoke in fragments, short conversations about diapers and bottles, about whether the laundry was folded, about how to rotate visitors. Grandparents came with careful, undisruptive hands, bringing old sweaters and patient smiles. As months passed, the babies grew, and the NICU visits became clinics. Each well visit that showed good weight gain and appropriate development was a small coronation. We celebrated milestones privately. The first coordinated sleep stretch beyond 3 hours, the first time one of them lifted their head, the first family outing where all 4 fit into a single stroller. The world felt brighter and more ordinary in these small increments. Grief, our old companion, didn't vanish. Sometimes it returned in unexpected ways. A late-night phone call that startled us both into remembering losses that had preceded this joy. A song on the radio that made me cry without warning. But the pain began to layer with empathy, rather than being the only texture. Our losses had made us tender. Now, when friends came with their own sorrow, failed tests, broken hopes, we could sit with them in a way that felt raw and true. We started to host a small monthly gathering in our living room for women who had experienced miscarriage or infant loss. The group became a place to name sorrow publicly and to practice the awkward art of being present. We offered soup, tissues, and the simple permission to be both angry and hopeful at once. I started to volunteer time to the hospital's bereavement and support program. Sitting with someone who had just received bad news was never a performance of platitudes. We listened. Sometimes we did practical things, brought a casserole, sat through hours of silence. Sometimes we held their hands and let them collapse into the reality of grief. Those encounters reminded me of something crucial. My story isn't a template to be copied, and none of our joy erases the pain others carry. Instead, it's a story that widened my capacity to hold both. When I spoke at church several months later, it felt strange and natural in equal measure. I told the story not as a spectacle, but as testimony, the kind that names both the wounds and the unexpected mercies. I said, I don't promise this will happen for everyone. I can only tell you what happened to me. After 4 losses, we had a surprise of 4 lives. I paused and met people's eyes. If you are in a season of grief, I will not minimize your pain. I will sit with you, and I will bring you soup.
Hope is not a promise of specific outcomes. It is a practice of living. People came up after my talk. Some spoke of their own losses, the words heavy as anchors and tender as thread. Others asked practical questions about NICU logistics and how to ask for help. I answered honestly, sometimes with medical facts I'd learned, and sometimes simply by saying, I don't know. That I don't know felt like a relief. Truth disarms pretense. There were moments of levity too, because life insists on humor. My husband started recording quad calendar entries with jokes only he found funny. Diaper duty, dirty or compostable. People laughed, and it cut through the intensity like a knife through cloth. We celebrated our first holiday with 4 babies like a ritual where chaos was sanctified, tiny feet tucked under blankets while relatives passed casseroles and tried to remember names. A year later, when the babies had grown into chubby, communicative toddlers, life had a new cadence.
There were still doctor appointments, but the frequency had eased. They slept in a room together, a soft chorus of breath and twitching limbs. We had become adept at juggling schedules, at dozing on the couch while one toddler napped and another demanded a picture book. The four of them, names that had floated around our house for months and finally stuck, filled our days with laughter and a volume of noise that was its own blessing. In that quieter hour after the children went to bed one evening, I sat at the kitchen table with my husband, and we cupped mugs of tea, the steam fogging in the low light. He looked at me with the kind of simplicity that had steadied us through fear. "We made it," he said. It was such a small sentence for what it contained. We had made it through losses, through scares, through nights of not knowing. He reached across the table and took my hand. It's not my place to say why God does what God does. I cannot convert someone else's sorrow into a stepping stone for my testimony. What I can say is this: loss taught me how to grieve with dignity, and the surprise of these 4 lives taught me how to receive help without shame. The intersection of human medicine and spiritual mystery is a narrow path walked with many companions. Faith did not make the hard things vanish, but it gave me language to ask for strength and the courage to accept community. If you've wrestled with waiting, with the ache of empty arms, I see you. I know the place where hope feels like a brittle coin you don't want to spend. You don't have to speak to me, but I will listen if you choose to. The best gift our experience gave us was the ability to sit with others in their sorrow without the pressure to fix it. A final practical note, not as clinical advice but as a lived-out lesson: if you are walking a similar path, build a team, medical, emotional, and practical. Ask for help. Let your community hold you.
Plan with clinicians, but do not let fear starve you of each small, profound moment when joy comes. And if the news you get is not the one you hoped for, please know this: I will not simplify your pain with easy words. I will not tell you it was meant to be. I will give you time to be furious, sad, or empty. I will offer you soup, and I will hold your hand. That, more than anything, felt like grace. If this story touched you, please consider sharing it with someone who needs hope. And if you're comfortable, leave a comment. Tell us you're here, or type "I see you," so others know they are not alone. There are resources linked in the description for support groups and counseling if you're coping with loss. Subscribe for more testimonies and practical conversations about faith and healing. We'll keep walking together. 1 year after the births, on a bright spring morning, the 4 of them tumbled into the backyard with mismatched socks and a ball that had lost most of its roundness. I sat on the porch with my seed necklace hidden under my shirt and watched their small bodies chase one another, their laughter spilling into the yard. My husband sat beside me and put an arm around my shoulders, and for a moment the long road that had brought us here fell into a line behind us, like a trail through a forest, worn, rough, and marked by small, persistent lights. I don't know what the next season will hold. I have learned to live with questions that don't have tidy answers. I know this, though: sorrow and joy can sit beside each other without canceling one another out. I know the dignity of grief and the extraordinary cost of receiving help. And I know that our story, as unlikely as it sounds, is one thread in a tapestry too broad for any of us to judge. If you're carrying wounds, I see you. If you're feeling numb or furious or empty, sit with that. If you need support, ask. Let someone be with you. If you felt something in this story, hope, pain, curiosity, share it, because we are learning that the best way through is often through the hand of another. We still breathe the same way we used to: in for 4, hold for 4, out for 6. We do it when the day feels too much, and when the day is full of small, ordinary miracles. We breathe, and we hold each other's hands.